Of the Education Assessment Accountability Review Subcommittee to order. Mariah, please take the roll.
Senator Deneen.
Here.
Senator Neal. Senator Wilson. Here. Representative Banta.
Present.
Representative Bojanowski.
Present.
Representative Riley.
Here.
Senator West.
Here.
Representative Lewis.
Here. All right. Looks like we have a quorum. Our first item on the agenda, we've got a presentation from the Office of Education Accountability and Review. Oh, excuse me. We need to approve the minutes first, so you all have to just wait. Then I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Now, let's get on to our agenda. We have a presentation from the Office of Education Accountability report on a review of effectiveness and efficiency of school districts. If you all would just turn your green mic button on there, introduce yourself for the record, and you may proceed.
Bartley Guari, Office of Education Accountability.
Chris Riley, Office of Education Accountability.
Deborah Nelson, Office of Education Accountability. Good morning. This study uses lessons learned from existing research on effectiveness and efficiency in education to analyze differences in the educational spending and outcomes among Kentucky's 171 school districts and between Kentucky and the nation. Overall, the study finds that Kentucky spends and achieves slightly below the nation. Analysis of Kentucky district spending and outcomes shows that higher spending districts, on average, have higher need populations and lower outcomes. When student demographics are considered, outcomes vary little by district spending. But outcomes vary considerably among districts. In other words, dollar for dollar, some districts are much more effective at impacting student outcomes than others. These more effective school districts are much more likely than others to have favorable teacher working conditions and lower teacher turnover. And lastly, small districts face challenges related to efficiencies of scale that are outside of administrators' control. These challenges may negatively affect student achievement in some districts. We'll begin with some background. Effectiveness and efficiency researchers include those who generally advocate for increased spending and those who urge caution. Both camps agree on the following points. The relationship between spending and outcomes is complicated. Salaries and benefits are the majority of expenditures in all districts and are an important focus of analysis. Related to this point, our most recent 2022 Kentucky data showed that salaries and benefits comprised almost 90% of district general fund expenditures. Some districts face efficiency-related challenges that are outside administrators' control. Well-known factors are listed on the screen, and we'll discuss them in greater detail later in the presentation. Before leaving this slide, I'll note that we focus on these 4 factors in the study in order to lay out key considerations in understanding the relationship between spending and outcomes. But these factors do not begin to explain the variation in human behavior underlying this question. Nothing that we say contradicts the first statement, which I will read again. The relationship between spending and outcomes is complicated, not entirely understood, and often not observable in the short term. This slide will illustrate some of the challenges in drawing conclusions about districts' effectiveness and efficiency based on surface data. The data do not exactly represent any particular Kentucky districts, but do illustrate the types of differences that exist. District A has higher average proficiency rates in reading and mathematics compared to District B, and spends less. District A appears more effective and efficient than District B. We might conclude that if District B adopted the practices used in District A, it would be more effective and efficient. But what if we learn that few students in District A, but most students in District B, are economically disadvantaged? And that most adults in District A, but few in District B, are college educated? We might also learn that in contrast to District A, District B is a geographically dispersed district and must transport most children many miles each day. Would we still be confident in assuming District A is more effective and efficient than District B? The central questions of the Kentucky district analysis in the study follow from this example. The study asks, which factors explain spending differences among Kentucky districts? What is the relationship between district spending and outcomes once student and community demographic characteristics are taken into account? And what characteristics are associated with effective districts? The report compares district per pupil spending in reading and mathematics outcomes in 2018, 2019, and 2022. It uses 3 years of data in order to allow for variations that occur in some of our small districts from year to year. Data from the 2020 and 2021 school years were either unavailable or incomplete due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this report, districts are considered effective based on an impact score that compares reading and math performance of district students with demographically similar students across the state. Effective districts are those that score above what would be predicted based on student and community characteristics. Once relatively more and less effective districts were identified, staff looked for differences among these higher and lower impact districts. OA did not visit, interview, or otherwise collect original district data for this report, so the characteristics of effective districts that we identify are limited to those that can be determined from available data, as described on the next slide. The study used data primarily from the Kentucky Department of Education. These included student-level data and district-level data. Additional sources include the Kentucky Center for Statistics. The report identifies contextual factors that are beyond administrators' control and known to affect efficiency. Findings of the report may be used as a lens on current district performance. These data go back all the way to 2018 that we're about to show you. Current data are available from the sources listed. OEA staff would be happy to assist you in accessing these data if needed. For reasons discussed in the report, impact scores for individual districts are not reported in the study. We'll turn now to look at Kentucky's spending and outcomes compared with the nation over time and with the most recent data available. This analysis covers more years than the Kentucky district analysis. The figure shows per pupil spending in Kentucky and the nation between 1970 and 2019. Spending is reported in 2019 dollars. The figure shows that since 1970, education spending has increased steeply in Kentucky and the nation. The gap between Kentucky's spending and the nation's closed considerably between 1970 and 2000, especially in the decade between 1990 and 2000 following the Kentucky Education Reform Act. Finally, since 2000, spending in Kentucky and the nation has increased relatively little. This figure shows reading and math proficiency rates at the 4th and 8th grades averaged together for Kentucky and the U.S. between 2003 and 2022. 2003 is the first year that all 4 grades were available together, but appendices of the report show earlier years and individual subjects. Between 2003 and 2015, when Kentucky's average proficiency rate slightly surpassed the nation's, Kentucky's proficiency rate increased at a greater rate than the nation's. Beginning in 2015, proficiency rates in Kentucky declined slightly, and this was caused by declines in reading. In 2022, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, proficiency rates in both Kentucky and the nation dropped substantially. This table shows the most current data available comparing Kentucky and national per pupil expenditures. Unlike the longitudinal data shown previously, these are adjusted for regional cost of living differences. Taking those differences into account, Kentucky's per pupil expenditures were 94% as much as the nation's in 2020, but its instructional expenditures were only 91% as much as the nation's. So like some of our inefficient small districts, Kentucky has less purchasing power to affect education per dollar. Kentucky's relatively lower spending on instruction compared with the nation reflects increased food and transportation costs in the Commonwealth associated with operating more rural and remote districts. We'll move now to discuss efficiency challenges that affect Kentucky districts and discuss how these are associated with district per pupil spending. The tables on the next two slides list efficiency challenges that increase district costs and are beyond administrators' control. Most Kentucky districts face one or more of these challenges. Some of these efficiency challenges are associated with additional dedicated funding. Higher need populations are more costly to educate. Based on these populations, districts receive additional federal funding and state funding through weights included in the state's base funding formula. Of these weights, special education generates the greatest amount of additional revenue. Small districts are more costly to operate due to higher overhead costs and inefficiencies of scale. And this is true of small districts nationally. For purposes of analysis, this study considers districts with 1,000 or fewer districts to be small. However, districts that exceed that threshold may also be considered small by national standards. Small districts do not receive additional funding in Kentucky. As noted in the report, however, most small districts are independent school districts. Higher costs in ISDs are supported in part by additional local revenue generated by local communities who have been willing over time to authorize additional taxes. Geographic dispersion also increases district costs, especially related to transportation. Geographic dispersion is taken into account in the SEEK transportation calculation. Districts that are more dispersed received relatively more funding. Districts in higher cost labor markets are also more expensive to operate. To attract and retain teachers, these districts must pay relatively higher salaries than districts in lower cost labor markets. Labor market competitiveness is measured by a federally developed indicator based on wages of college graduates that are not teachers. This is known as the CWIFT and shown on the next slide. Revenue among districts in higher cost labor markets vary considerably in the Commonwealth. They are disproportionately among the highest and lowest spending districts. This map shows Kentucky districts by CWIFT indicator as of 19, the most recent year available. As I noted on the previous slide, the CWIFT is a federally developed indicator. It is based on census data. Higher cost labor markets are shown in darker colors. You can see that higher cost labor markets are concentrated in central and northern Kentucky and some districts that border other states. In addition, labor market costs appear associated with some of our major highways, such as I-65, I-75, and the Mountain Parkway. We'll move now to look at the range and per pupil spending among Kentucky districts. This figure shows district per pupil expenditures, which increase from left to right along the bottom horizontal axis. And this is shown against the percent of economically disadvantaged students, which increase from the bottom to the top of the figure. This line divides districts that are above and below the average of economically disadvantaged students across all districts. District membership is shown by the size of each bubble. Across the top, you can see that the figure divides districts into three spending categories: lower, average, and higher. I'll pause briefly here to note that some of the slides in this presentation condense information shown in the report to make them easier to understand. We'll focus now on a few features of the data shown in this figure. First, as district per pupil spending increases from left to right, so does the percentage of economically disadvantaged students in each district, on average. Most of the lower spending districts, those on the left, are below the average of economically disadvantaged students for all districts, whereas most of the higher spending districts on the right are above that average. You may also notice that many of the higher spending districts on the right are small. As shown in the full report, efficiency challenges such as those just described generally increase as district spending increases. On average, higher versus lower spending districts have higher percentages of economically disadvantaged students, higher percentages of special education students, and are 4 times more likely to be small. You can see that the state's 2 largest school districts are also highest spending, and the report breaks out data for these 2 districts separately. The report does note one challenge that applies disproportionately to some of the lowest spending districts, shown on the left. Most of these districts are in higher cost labor markets. Considering the relatively lower spending, some may struggle to offer competitive salaries in these labor markets. The next section of this presentation will show differences in student reading and mathematics outcomes among the 3 spending categories highlighted on this slide and outlined by the 3 boxes: lower spending, average spending, and higher spending. You'll see that the comparisons of district spending and student outcomes reflect the demographic characteristics of students in those districts. Students in the most economically disadvantaged, higher spending districts will have relatively lower outcomes than students in the lower spending districts that are less economically disadvantaged. The next section will also look at the relationship between spending and outcomes when differences in demographic characteristics are taken into account. And Chris Riley will now discuss these comparisons.
Thank you, Deb. This section of the presentation will cover the relationship between district spending and outcomes. I'll begin by summarizing what the data will show in this section. First, the relationship between district spending and actual outcomes is negative. As spending increases, outcomes decrease. As just noted, this trend reflects the fact that higher need populations are disproportionately in higher spending districts, and outcomes for these students across the state are lower. Next, outcomes vary little by district spending, on average. Once students and community demographic characteristics are considered, this is done using the impact model, which I will describe shortly. Even after these adjustments, however, higher spending districts remain relatively lower. Finally, the data will show that student outcomes among similarly spending districts vary considerably. Dollar for dollar, some districts are much more effective than others. This is true whether we look at districts' actual scores or scores that are adjusted in the district impact model. We'll begin by looking at the relationship between actual student outcomes and district spending. Districts are grouped into 3 performance categories shown at the top of the slide, based on the combined reading and mathematics achievement for all students in grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. The categories are shown at the top of the slide. From left to right at the bottom of the slide, you will see the 3 categories of district spending discussed earlier. The percentage of districts that were in the lower performance categories are shown in dark gray. Increases district spending increases. Now we will bring in the percentage of districts in the average reading and math performance category, represented by the medium gray portion of the stack bar, and the percentage of districts in the higher performance category are shown with the lightest gray color at the top of each stack bar. If we focus on the stack bars on the left, we can see that nearly half of the districts in the lowest per pupil spending category were in the higher actual performance category. And when looking at the stack bars on the right, we can see that nearly 2/3 of the districts in the higher per pupil spending category were in the lower performance category for actual reading and math scores. We know, however, that most of these higher spending districts exceed the state average for economically disadvantaged students. Would average and higher spending districts look relatively more effective if students in their district were measured against similar students in other districts? This brings us back to the District A and District B example shown earlier in the presentation. We'll begin our discussion of the impact score model here. Let's begin with District A. Instead of judging district performance by their actual score, which in this example is 60% average proficiency, we will ask, how do District A students compare with students who are not economically disadvantaged and live in communities of mostly college-educated adults? If actual scores for those other students was the equivalent to 65% proficiency, then District A would look below average on district impact. Similarly, we would ask how the performance of District B students compared with other students who are economically disadvantaged and live in communities with few college-educated adults. If actual scores of those other students was equivalent to 33% proficiency, then District B would look far above average and would likely be in the higher impact category. This slide represents the general steps used to calculate district impact for the report. The statistical model used to calculate impact considered a wider variety of demographic characteristics than those discussed for the District A and District B example. Those characteristics are shown in the gray box. Based on the combination of each student's characteristics, the model gave each student a predicted score. Many of the factors shown, such as limited English proficiency, serve to lower the predicted score. Living in a community with higher percentages of adults with bachelor's degrees would have increased the predicted score. The predicted score for each student was subtracted from the actual score to determine the impact for each student. Those impact scores were then aggregated to the district level to produce the district impact. As with actual scores, OEA grouped districts by impact scores into categories. As the report notes, most district categories did not shift dramatically when computed from actual versus impact scores. The higher impact districts were districts in which students scored far above demographically similar students. Most higher impact districts have relatively high actual scores. Some, like District B, are higher poverty districts that may not appear high performing by actual scores. On the other end of the spectrum, we have lower impact districts, which were districts in which students score far below demographically similar students. Most lower impact districts were also relatively lower performing in actual scores. None of the lower impact districts had higher actual scores. In the next slide, we will show that the relationship between district impact and spending is somewhat different from the relationship between actual performance and spending. This figure will look similar to the first one I showed that grouped districts by spending and actual performance categories. Recall that the earlier figure showed decreases in performance as spending increased across each category. In this slide, the performance categories are determined by impact scores. As you can see, once student demographic characteristics are taken into account, district performance looks fairly similar among the lower and average spending districts. Most Kentucky districts fall in these categories. Many higher spending districts look relatively more effective based on the impact score. However, higher spending districts are still somewhat more likely than others to be in lower impact categories. As the report notes, most of the higher spending, lower impact districts are small. Before leaving this slide, I will note again that within each spending category, some districts are much more effective at impacting student reading and mathematics outcomes than others. The next section will discuss characteristics of higher impact districts, shown in the light gray at the top of each stack bar, and the lower impact districts shown in the dark gray at the bottom. The characteristics of these higher and lower impact districts are true for districts at all spending levels.
Thank you, Chris. In this section, we'll highlight 3 differences among the higher and lower impact districts that Chris just discussed. Higher impact districts are able to take revenue similar to what is received in other districts and assist students to achieve reading and math outcomes that exceed demographically similar students. From a fiscal standpoint, they are engines of efficiency. We'll begin with teacher working conditions. Every 2 years, all Kentucky teachers take a KDE Teacher Working Conditions Survey. OEA grouped districts by the percent of teachers that reported favorable working conditions on this survey in 2020. At the district level, the percent of favorable responses ranged from a low of 40 to a high of 85%. OEA categorized districts in the lowest 2 quartiles based on these responses as having relatively less favorable working conditions. This slide shows the percent of districts in the higher, average, and lower impact categories that had relatively less favorable working conditions, as reported by teachers on the survey. 67% of lower impact districts had relatively less favorable conditions. This was more than 5 times greater than the percentage in higher impact districts. Question categories that particularly distinguished higher from lower impact districts are shown on this slide, along with examples of conditions teachers rated in the survey, such as the positive attitude of colleagues, thoroughness of feedback and coaching, and positive influence of school leaders on teaching. These data reflect research suggesting strong relationships between leadership and student outcomes. Local leaders can influence the quality of school leadership and other teacher working conditions through the way they manage school principals and allocate the instructional and additional resources that support working conditions. We'll move now to look at data on teacher turnover. This slide shows that 40% of lower impact districts have higher teacher turnover rates of 15% or more. This is more than 10 times the 4% of higher impact districts with higher turnover rates. As we note in the report, district level turnover data can mask higher school levels of teacher turnover in some large districts. So before leaving the slide, I'll remind you that these data are based on 18-19 and 2022, but as our colleagues will show in a few weeks, teacher attrition is something that is confronting the entire state increasingly since then and really presents an efficiency challenge for the state. Research suggests that teacher turnover is highly associated with working conditions at the school level. While the 2 indicators are related at the district level, they also operate separately from each other. The report shows that none of the districts with very high working condition survey scores had high turnover rates. In these districts, highly favorable conditions may contribute to teacher retention. Teacher turnover at the district level and teacher working conditions also operate independently. There are some districts with relatively less favorable working conditions and also lower turnover. Many of these are rural or remote districts in which alternative employment may not be available. Also, some districts have higher turnover, although they are not among the districts with least favorable working conditions. These may be districts in higher cost labor markets where teachers have easier access to jobs with more competitive salaries. This figure shows teacher turnover by Kentucky district. Districts with higher turnover are indicated in darker colors. Many of the districts with higher turnover are the same as those shown earlier in relatively more competitive labor markets. This map also shows the likely influence of teacher salaries on turnover rates in some districts. For example, Jefferson County Public Schools pays higher salaries than most in its surrounding area. You can see by the colors that the districts bordering Jefferson County have relatively higher turnover rates. These and other districts in higher cost labor markets may be struggling at their current revenue levels to offer competitive salaries. As indicated by the map, teacher turnover on average is greater among districts in higher cost labor markets. In those labor markets, teacher salary and teacher turnover are associated. Teacher turnover is greater in districts with relatively less competitive salaries. Appendix I of the report provides district-level data related to these points. We'll move now to consider small districts. As I noted earlier, OEA designated districts with 1,000 or fewer students as small. Overall, about 1/5 of Kentucky districts are small. This figure shows that small districts are in every performance category. In fact, some small districts are among the highest performing in the state. But small districts are disproportionately in lower impact categories. The percentage of lower impact districts that are small is about twice the percentage of higher impact districts that are small. Districts in the average and lower impact categories, small districts in those categories, are more likely than higher impact districts to face additional efficiency challenges. The report shows that, like small districts nationally, Kentucky small districts spend a lower percentage of total spending on instruction than do other districts. As shown earlier, smaller districts are disproportionately in higher spending categories, and many are supported in part by relatively higher tax rates of local communities. Many higher spending ISDs are in lower impact categories, despite this additional revenue. I'll pause here, though, to note, as we say in the report, small ISDs perform similarly to small county districts. Also, the report notes that independent school districts that are not small, on average, have higher impact scores than county districts that are not small. Actions might be taken at the local and state levels to address challenges of small districts. Before hitting the points on this slide, I will note that a few sentences in the final report will be updated from the draft you have seen. The final draft of the report will be consistent with the language you hear on this slide. ISDs have the option to request merger with the county in which the ISD is located. As the report notes, multiple ISDs have merged in recent years. County districts have not merged in the past. The process guiding merger of county district is laid out in statute. Some states provide additional funding for small districts. Kentucky does not. This figure will summarize data we have shown in this section, showing substantial differences among higher and lower impact districts in less favorable working conditions, higher teacher turnover, and the percent of small districts. Of these characteristics, those related to the teacher workforce affect a larger percentage of districts. In conclusion, as the data in the report have shown, the relationship between spending and actual outcomes reflect demographic differences among lower and higher spending districts. Once student demographic characteristics are taken into account, district effectiveness varies little by spending level. However, higher spending districts are still relatively lower. Student outcomes among similarly spending districts vary considerably. Excuse me. Some districts are much more effective and efficient than others. Data in the report highlight the three areas we have just discussed as meriting attention. Allergies, don't worry. Addressing the challenges noted in the report require collective efforts related to teacher working conditions and turnover. Data in the report suggests that given the revenue available, some districts are much more successful than others at addressing these challenges. Some may prioritize competitive salaries over other expenses. Others may focus resources on leadership development or other programs or supports that foster favorable working conditions. Data in the report also suggests that some districts may be struggling at current revenue levels to offer competitive salaries or supports responsive to needs in their teacher labor markets. In these districts, increased revenue may play an important role in allowing them to address turnover or working conditions. In deliberating on budget decisions, the General Assembly may consider whether SEEK funding allows districts to keep pace with labor market demands. Addressing challenges related to inefficiencies in small districts may also require collective efforts. Oops, sorry. Communities of independent school districts that may be struggling to raise revenue to sufficiently support instruction have the option to request merger. The General Assembly may also consider small funding weights in the SEEK formula. This concludes the presentation. We would be happy to take your questions about any of the data shown here or any of the data in the report.
Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you very much. Question. So you found some concerns about efficiency and effectiveness with the very small districts. Did you find any concerns about the large districts regarding efficiency and effectiveness through these measures?
So as we note in the report, we are really not providing data that would identify particular districts. However, it is true to say that that trend you see after you adjust for district impact, the trend you see with the relatively lower impact districts, even after these adjustments, this would primarily affect, this is primarily influenced by smaller districts.
May I ask one more?
And I will also note that the data provides a lot of lenses on how you can look at district effectiveness and efficiency. So you may be able to take data in the report related to teacher working conditions, teacher attrition, and apply them to districts of larger size, which have basically internal markets that differ on those conditions.
So one more question. So in the calculating total average or the average per pupil expenditures, can you provide us with a document that just shows what all line items go into calculating that? And then do you just divide it by the number of students? Just specific. I mean, it does say that certain expenses aren't included, but could you just give us the actual list or maybe...
We took those data straight from the district data profiles and...
Okay,
and
so it's worked up in there.
That's correct.
I'll go back to refer to that. Thank you very much.
Co-Chair West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, it's page 15 of our materials, but it's the slide that talks about KDE Teacher Working Conditions Survey. One of the bullet points says districts in the lowest 40% identified as relatively less favorable working conditions. Could you go into a little bit more detail on what?
Oh, I'm sorry. Which slide are you talking about?
Slide number 30, is that correct?
Oh, 30. Okay.
So-
Yes, I'm sorry, I couldn't read that.
Yep,
Yes,
slide
slide
30.
30, yes. The last bullet point.
And you're asking what went into it. Pretty much what was done was we looked into the TEL survey, and we had identified some items within there, and we had looked at the different constructs within the Kentucky Impact Survey. I'm using old terminology. Kentucky Impact Survey, and we had looked from there, and then we had taken the lowest 40% from that score.
So my question is, when it talks about working conditions, less favorable working conditions, what is that? Do you have specific items that these teachers would say, this would mean less favorable working conditions in my school?
If you look in Chapter 3 of the report, there is a figure that actually lists out, there's a table that lists out each category. And so in the survey, they will determine which is a favorable response, and that may differ on the individual question. And so in response to something like positive climate, an agree or strongly agree would be favorable working conditions. There may be other questions where it's the opposite, but that is determined internally to the survey, and they are the types of conditions that you would expect. We do note in the chapter that some of those categories are more predictive or more associated with higher and lower impact than others. For example, there's a question on staff leadership relations, essentially how warm they are. That one is very similar for higher and lower impact districts, and it really sort of the particular test questions that pull out the differences have more to do with climate, and then those things that might directly affect instruction. So some of the categories are sort of more predictive of higher and lower impact than others.
So I guess what I'm looking for is if we're trying to improve working conditions, we need like specific items. So an example would be school discipline. If there's a discipline issue, or the example you gave, inferior leadership, those are examples. Are you saying that the categories listed are those types of things?
Yes,
we can look to refer to that and see that's what's happening.
And I do want to clarify here that nothing that we said should indicate that if you look at a teacher working conditions survey and then you see that it's low, that you can definitely conclude that there is an inferior principal in that district. It's really, absolutely. We visited many Kentucky districts, over the years. Sometimes you'll have a new principal that is at the very beginning of, really trying to initiate changes. We visited districts where principals are trying to initiate changes that are important for student outcomes and very heavily resisted by local communities. So
are you saying good change is sometimes unpopular?
Yes. And so really using the teacher working conditions data would be something that, needs to be very finely tuned to the local conditions. And the survey is administered by a nonprofit, which provides a lot of resources for districts. So you can go on the Impact Kentucky survey website, and it really kind of goes through those individual categories. So and gives guidance about what can be done. So the what that follows looking at those data would really follow from the particular data of the districts. And then again, on some of the questions, you'd really have to go in and know the particular districts to know, is this an issue maybe at the school level? Is this an issue where the principal is trying to initiate a change that is heavily resisted by local boards or communities? We have found that. So you cannot draw simple conclusions based on it, but I think it's fair to say that collectively, in districts where you see those higher favorable working conditions, leadership is working. There's some alignment, principal, school board, superintendent, and all of those things are important. It's difficult to say exactly where the issue is just from looking at the data.
Thank you.
Any other member? Okay, I need a motion to approve this report. Got a motion by Representative Riley, second by Representative Bana. Motion approved. Thank you all very much for your presentation. A lot of good information in there, and hopefully we can use some of that, so thank you. In other business, next month, our next meeting, we'll approve our 2024 research agenda. And I've just thrown one out here for you all to look at. We can take others, and then next month we'll have to approve ours. The Senate's already approved their research agenda, so it would be up to us as the House to approve ours also next month. Any other business? Need a motion to adjourn? Motion. Got a motion to second. Meeting adjourned.